Something that has not happened since the Civil War era is arriving tomorrow, and the last time Neptune entered Aries, the world that existed before it could not survive what followed. Not because a planet destroyed it, because the collective capacity to maintain the illusions that had held the old world together was withdrawn. What had been possible to ignore became impossible to ignore. What had been sustained by collective agreement became visible as sustained by collective agreement, and at that moment, everything that depended on the agreement began to change. That is what Neptune entering Aries does to a civilization. And tomorrow, March 30th, 2026, it does it again. The point worth examining from the beginning is not whether you believe in astrology. The Hermetic tradition, the framework that produced as above, so below, does not require belief. It requires attention to the historical record. And the historical record of Neptune's previous transition into Aries is specific enough that it functions as something closer to a pattern than a prediction. Patterns do not require belief, they require observation. And if you are paying even partial attention to the current moment in human history, the pattern will be immediately recognizable. Neptune takes approximately 165 years to complete one full orbit around the Sun. When it moves from one sign to the next, it does not move quietly. It moves through institutions, through collective narratives, through the shared assumptions that a civilization has been treating as permanent. The branch of astrological study concerned with these large-scale cycles, mundane astrology, has documented the correspondence between Neptune's sign transits and the dissolution of collective frameworks that depended on sustained collective illusion. 165 years is the interval between those openings. 165 years, an entire human lifetime plus the next generation. The last people who were alive during the previous Neptune in Aries transit are gone. The civilizations they inhabited have transformed beyond recognition. The political structures, the economic arrangements, the philosophical certainties they took as permanent, most of them have already dissolved in subsequent cycles. What you are entering tomorrow is a window that none of the people currently living have any personal memory of. There is no one to ask what it was like from inside it. The only record is history. What actually changes when a planet like Neptune shifts into a sign like Aries? The surface-level answer, that astrological influences shift, carries very little weight unless you understand what those terms actually mean in the context of the tradition that used them. The deeper answer has to do with what Neptune represents at the level of collective consciousness, and what happens when the specific energy Aries carries receives what Neptune is bringing. Those are two different questions, and each of them has a specific answer in the historical record. You are watching this at a particular moment. Whatever sequence of clicks and searches brought you here, you are here now, in the 24 hours before this transit begins. The traditions that track these cycles did not treat timing as incidental. In the framework of the Hermetic tradition, the moment when a person encounters specific information is part of the information itself. You are not watching this as an outside observer of a pattern that does not concern you. You are inside it, and you found this before it begins. If this kind of deep pattern knowledge speaks to you, the kind that looks at history not as a sequence of random events, but as a map of recurring cycles, subscribe to this channel. This is where we keep building on this work together. Neptune, in the language of mundane astrology, the branch that studies planetary cycles and their correspondence with collective human events, is associated with a specific quality of mass experience, the dissolution of what has become too rigid to sustain, the exposure of collective illusions, the rising of what had been submerged beneath the surface of shared awareness. What the Roman designation Neptune and the earlier Greek designation Poseidon were encoding was a recognition of a specific quality of energy, the kind that does not announce itself through direct confrontation, but through the gradual withdrawal of the substrate on which old structures had been resting. The god Neptune governed the deep waters, the unknown depths, what lies below the visible surface of things. Ancient cultures were not being poetic when they mapped this mythological function onto cycles of collective experience. They were recording a consistent pattern that the energy corresponding to what they called Neptune operates through dissolution, through the slow erosion of what no longer has genuine substance beneath it. The frameworks that a civilization has been maintaining by collective agreement, the shared narratives that give institutions their appearance of permanence, begin to show that they were always maintained by agreement, not by structural reality. And once that becomes visible, the agreement is very difficult to re-establish. This is the inversion that changes how to understand what Neptune actually does. It does not bring new structures. It removes old ones. It does not build. It reveals. When Neptune is active in the collective, when its transit corresponds to a period of heightened dissolution, the question is not what arrives. The question is what is no longer supported. The illusions that a civilization has been collectively maintaining, the stories that required everyone to agree not to look too closely at the contradictions, begin to lose their hold on the collective capacity for avoidance. What was conveniently blurry becomes disconcertingly sharp. Picture what happens when a long drought finally ends and significant rain comes to ground that has been dry for years. What was buried in the soil? Seeds, but also the remains of what died in the previous cycle. Also the structures that were only standing because the ground had been solid begins to shift. The arrival of the rain does not create what rises. It reveals what was always there under the surface, waiting for the conditions that would allow it to move. Neptune operates through something analogous in the collective psyche. It does not bring the crisis. It brings the conditions under which what was already present beneath the surface can no longer remain beneath it. And what is Aries? In the same tradition, Aries is the first sign of the zodiac for a specific reason. It represents the pure initiating impulse, the spark before the structure, the fire that precedes the architecture. Aries does not build patiently. It does not wait for consensus or comfortable conditions. It ignites. It breaks from what came before with the force of something that can no longer be contained by the previous form. In the historical record of collective human events, Aries energy has consistently corresponded with the kind of ruptures that cannot be negotiated, the ones that simply begin, often before the structures that would have prevented them have finished adjusting. Dissolution meeting ignition, revelation meeting the force that refuses to remain contained, the slow erosion of collective illusions, suddenly accelerated by the energy of a sign that does not pause at thresholds. That is what Neptune entering Aries represents in the mundane astrological tradition, not a period of peaceful transition, not clarity emerging gently from fog, movement at the speed that Aries imposes. The question that matters is not whether that movement will happen. It will happen. The question is what your relationship to it will be. The field of mundane astrology, the systematic study of planetary cycles and their correspondence with collective human experience, has produced serious scholarly work on precisely these questions. Michael Bagent, Nicholas Campion, and Charles Harvey, whose foundational text, Mundane Astrology, represents one of the most rigorous treatments of this subject, specifically examined Neptune's transits through the signs and their documented historical correspondences. Their analysis was not predictive in the simplistic sense. It was pattern-based, identifying what kinds of collective experiences have tended to correspond with Neptune's movements through different signs based on the historical record. Neptune was discovered in 1846, which means that the systematic record of its movement through all 12 signs extends across 2 full orbits since then. What that record shows, and what the mundane astrological tradition has documented most carefully, is that Neptune's transitions between signs have tended to correspond with the dissolution of the collective frameworks that defined the previous era. What was assumed to be the permanent structure of society reveals itself as provisional. What was treated as the natural order of things becomes visible as an arrangement, something chosen, something that could be arranged differently. The moment that visibility arrives, everything dependent on the assumption of permanence begins to change. There is a quality to Neptune transits that serious practitioners of mundane astrology describe with the metaphor of fog becoming visible. The fog was always present, in the form of collective narratives that were never examined closely, assumptions built into institutions, beliefs that functioned more as social comfort than as accurate descriptions of reality. Neptune's movement does not create the fog. It creates the conditions under which the fog becomes impossible to ignore. And Aries is the energy that, once it receives that visibility, refuses to remain inside the comfortable obscurity the fog provided. Aries is the sign that acts on what it sees. The combination is specific in its implications. Most encounters with astrology in contemporary culture treat planetary movement as deterministic. Neptune enters Aries, therefore specific events will occur. The tradition that produced the serious study of these cycles, the Hermetic tradition, the mundane astrological schools, the ancient mystery traditions that used astronomical cycles as orientation instruments, does not work that way. What the Hermetic principle of correspondence, as above, so below, actually claims is something more nuanced and, when examined carefully, more useful, that the cycles above correspond to patterns already present below, and that knowing the cycle gives you orientation, not prediction. The map does not control the territory, it reads it, and right now the map is showing something that has not been shown since 1861. If what we're building here is landing with you as more than astrological curiosity, write in the comments right now. I am in the Neptune window, not as a spiritual claim, as an acknowledgement of the specific timing you are living inside. To understand what Neptune entering Aries does in practice, the most useful evidence is not theory. It is the record of what happened the last time this transit occurred. The historical record is specific. Neptune entered Aries in April 1861, marking the beginning of a transit window that would last approximately 14 years. The world that greeted that transit was, by most available measures, functioning. The major institutions were intact. The major political structures were in place. The frameworks that organized collective life were being maintained. And in the 14 years that followed, most of what appeared stable dissolved in ways that few of the people living through it anticipated. 6 weeks after Neptune entered Aries in 1861, Confederate forces opened fire on Fort Sumter, South Carolina. The American Civil War had begun. What followed was the most violent internal conflict in American history, a war that would kill more Americans than any conflict before or since, fought over the question of whether a democracy could continue to function as a democracy while enslaving human beings as property. The conflict had been building for decades. The political compromises that had postponed it, the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, were each a delay of a reckoning that the structure of American society had been approaching for generations. Neptune in Aries withdrew the collective capacity for one more delay. The Civil War was not what Neptune in Aries created. The Civil War was what Neptune in Aries revealed. The institution of American slavery, the illusion that a republic founded on the principle that all men are created equal could sustain itself on the unpaid labor of human beings, legally classified as property, had been maintained through decades of political compromise, economic rationalization, and the collective unwillingness to confront what the system actually was. What the Neptune in Aries transit dissolved was not the institution itself, but the collective capacity to maintain the convenient fiction that the contradiction could continue indefinitely. What had been managed as a problem became visible as a structural impossibility. The compromises failed. What had postponed the confrontation, the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, the various political arrangements designed to keep the contradiction from becoming an open rupture, each of them a maintenance of an illusion that the opposing values could coexist permanently within a single political structure. Neptune in Aries did not end those compromises through external force. It ended the collective capacity to believe in them. The illusion that the contradiction was manageable became impossible to sustain. What had been negotiable became non-negotiable. What had been political became structural. And Aries, receiving that revelation, did not pause at the threshold. It acted. At the same time, the same Neptune in Aries transit, the Industrial Revolution was reaching its irreversible inflection point in the United States and Europe. Steam power was displacing human and animal labor at a rate that was rewriting the economics of every industry it touched. The way human beings organized production, distance, time, and the distribution of wealth was transforming in ways that had no precedent in recorded history. The agricultural world that had organized most of human civilization for millennia was not declining. It was dissolving. The new industrial order was arriving not as a gradual transition, but as an accelerating rupture with the economic structures of the previous era. What does that look and feel like from inside a major transition? The people living through the 1860s did not experience it as historical inevitability. They did not have the retrospective clarity that allows later generations to describe the period as the beginning of the modern era. They experienced it as chaos, as rupture, as the collapse of the frameworks that had given their lives structure and predictability. The economic certainties, the political arrangements, the social hierarchies that had seemed as permanent as the landscape. These were dissolving faster than new frameworks could be established to replace them. The disorientation was not incidental. It was the experience of living through a transition between structural realities. Here is what the historical record shows about what was simultaneously being built during the Neptune in Aries transit of the 1860s. The abolitionist movement reached its irreversible momentum. President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation in January 1863. Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, published in 1859, was rewriting humanity's understanding of its own place in the natural order, precisely as every other framework was being rewritten. Karl Marx completed and published Das Kapital in 1867, a fundamental critique of the industrial economic order that was itself one of the most significant products of the transition period. These were not coincidences in the sense of unrelated events happening simultaneously. In the hermetic framework of correspondence, they were convergences of the same underlying dissolution. This is the structural pattern the historical record shows for Neptune in Aries. Dissolution of what could no longer be sustained on its own terms, and simultaneous ignition of what had been accumulating underneath. New ideas, new frameworks, new social realities that had no room inside the previous structure. The old world and the new one coexist in the transit window. The Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation coexist in the same 14-year period. The dissolution of the agrarian economic order and the emergence of the industrial one coexist in the same window. What falls and what ignites are not separate events. They are two phases of the same transition. The discomfort of Neptune in Aries, if the historical record is a reliable guide, is not the discomfort of a random difficult period. It is the discomfort of visibility, of the specific experience of the moment when what was always true becomes impossible not to see. The illusions that sustained the old structure are no longer performing their function. What was maintained by collective agreement becomes visible as maintained by collective agreement. And at that moment the question shifts from, can this be preserved, to, what do we do now that we can all see clearly? That is not the beginning of something going wrong. It is the beginning of something going honest. What fell in the 1860s had not been suddenly constructed before the transit began. It had been failing for decades. The cracks were documented, the arguments were being made, the evidence that the contradictions were structurally unresolvable was available to anyone who looked honestly. But the collective framework was maintaining the working assumption that these were manageable tensions within a system that was fundamentally sound. Neptune in Aries was the removal of that assumption. What had been cracking under the surface of collective awareness became the open fracture that could no longer be administratively contained. The failure was not Neptune's doing. Neptune only made visible what was already failing. Neptune moved through Aries from 1861 to approximately 1875. In those 14 years, the Civil War ended, with the Union preserved, but the underlying questions about what that preservation meant already showing the limits of the transformation. The Reconstruction era began with genuine possibility and was already revealing the resistance that would ultimately constrain it. The industrial economy consolidated in ways that were creating new concentrations of wealth alongside new categories of structural poverty. What the transit opened was not resolved by the end of the transit. What it dissolved could not be reconstituted. The old order was gone. The new order carried its own contradictions into the next cycle. Every serious examination of the Neptune in Aries period in the mundane astrological tradition shows the same structural pattern. Existing frameworks dissolving faster than new ones can be established to replace them, followed by a period of rapid structural innovation in whatever domains the dissolution touched most severely. Dissolution precedes construction. The architecture cannot be built until the site has been cleared. This is not presented as desirable in the tradition. The clearing is genuinely disorienting for the people living through it, but it is presented as the structural reality of how these transitions work. Neptune dissolves. Aries ignites what comes next. The sequence matters. What does framework dissolving look like from inside it in real time? The people who watched the American Civil War begin did not experience it as the initiation of a structural transformation that historians would later describe as the transition to modern American society. They experienced it as catastrophe, as the failure of everything that was supposed to hold, as the collapse of the certainties that had organized their understanding of what was possible and what was stable. The dissolution of frameworks that give a collective coherence, shared assumptions about what is real, what is possible, what is worth sustaining, happens from the inside outward. By the time the dissolution is fully visible from the outside, it has already been proceeding for much longer than most people realized. You already know what the current moment feels like from inside it. The institutions that were described as recently as a decade ago as permanent features of the global order are showing that they are not permanent. The economic arrangements that organized trade, labor, and wealth distribution across the previous era are being questioned in ways they were not being questioned 5 years ago. The political frameworks that most people alive today grew up treating as settled are showing their contingency, their dependence on conditions that are changing. Something in you has noticed this not as abstract observation, but as felt recognition. That recognition is part of what brings a person to a video about Neptune in Aries, the day before the transit begins. If this is resonating with you, let me know by liking this video. It helps more people find this content at the right moment. Neptune enters Aries on March 30th, 2026, tomorrow. The question the historical record forces is not whether a transition of some kind is underway in the collective. The evidence that collective frameworks are under significant pressure is available to anyone paying attention. The question Neptune entering Aries changes is more specific. It changes the nature of the collective capacity to maintain the illusions that have been softening the pressure. What Neptune in Pisces, the sign it is leaving, allowed was a particular kind of collective dreaminess, a capacity to hold competing realities in comfortable suspension without resolving the contradictions. That capacity is being withdrawn. Here is the inversion that makes the timing matter. Neptune in Pisces, which has been the quality of collective consciousness since 2011, corresponds in the mundane astrological tradition with periods of collective spiritual seeking, of idealism that expands beyond its practical anchoring, of the kind of cultural fog that makes it possible to sustain narratives that do not connect cleanly to observable reality. Pisces is the sign of the deep waters, of dreams, of the dissolution of boundaries, including the boundaries between convenient belief and clear sight. Neptune in Pisces amplified that quality. Neptune in Aries withdraws it. What Pisces allowed, the comfortable suspension of difficult clarity, Aries actively refuses. Imagine a long winter morning, the kind where low fog sits over everything and you cannot quite see where one thing ends and another begins. Shapes are present, but edges are soft. The difficult contrasts are muted. That is Neptune in Pisces as a quality of collective consciousness. The fog is not catastrophic, it softens. It makes the hard questions feel less urgent. It creates a kind of temporal suspension in which it is possible to hold "we will deal with this" as a functional orientation indefinitely. Neptune in Aries is when the sun rises fast and the fog burns off and the landscape shows itself completely, including the parts that the softened morning light was making easier not to see. What are the collective illusions that are about to become more difficult to maintain? The historical record does not support specific event-by-event prediction, and the Hermetic tradition does not claim that kind of determinism. What the structural pattern shows consistently is this: the institutions that have been maintained by shared belief in their permanence become visibly provisional. The economic arrangements that were assumed to represent the natural order of things reveal themselves as arrangements, choices that were made, that can be made differently. The political frameworks that seem to represent the only possible way of organizing collective life show their contingency. The question is not whether that visibility will arrive, it is what you will be capable of seeing clearly when it does. The fog lifts, not the way you might prefer, gradually with time to adjust and reorient comfortably. The Aries quality of this particular Neptune transit means the clarity arrives with the speed that Aries imposes. What you are seeing, you are going to see quickly. The question that matters, and that matters specifically right now, in the window before the transit begins, is not whether you will see the transitions. You will. The question is whether you have built enough internal clarity to understand what you are seeing when the external fog burns off, to recognize what is actually dissolving versus what is actually being initiated, to orient yourself not by the comfort of the previous framework, but by the accuracy of what the moment is showing. The widespread engagement with astrological cycles in contemporary culture focuses primarily on outer-world events, the political upheavals, the economic shifts, the social ruptures. What the more serious strands of the mundane astrological tradition and the Hermetic tradition that underpins it emphasize differently is this: The primary arena in which Neptune's work is conducted is not the outer world. It is consciousness. Events are consequences of changes in what collectives of human beings can and cannot sustain believing. The primary shift is in what becomes impossible for people to collectively pretend not to see. The outer world events are the legible consequences of that inner shift, the visible portion of a transformation that began in the collective unconscious long before it appeared in the institutions. The Hermetic principle of correspondence, as above so below, as within so without, applied to a Neptune in Aries, transit produces a specific implication at the personal level. The illusions you have been maintaining about your own life, your own situation, your own recurring patterns, the ones that Neptune in Pisces allowed you to hold in comfortable suspension, will become harder to sustain, not as punishment for having held them, as the natural consequence of the fog burning off. What was blurry because you chose not to look too directly will be lit by the same clarity that is being applied at the collective level. The as within, so without direction of the principle applies here. The outer world will begin to show you, with increasing precision, the actual state of the inner one. This is where Neptune in Aries becomes something other than an astronomical event, and something closer to a diagnostic tool. The dissolution that happened at the collective level in 1861, the impossibility of maintaining the shared illusion that American democracy could function while enslaving human beings, had a corresponding dissolution at the individual level for everyone living through that period. What they could no longer pretend not to know about the society they inhabited, they could also no longer pretend not to know about their own participation in it. The collective dissolution and the individual dissolution were not separate events. They were the same event at different scales. The correspondence principle was functioning in both directions simultaneously. The invitation of Neptune in Aries is not designed for comfort. The Hermetic tradition does not present its cycles as inherently pleasant or oriented toward the viewer's preference. It presents them as accurate. What the cycle does is reveal what is actually present in the collective, in the institutions, and in the internal structure of each person living through the transition. Whether that revelation is devastating or clarifying depends significantly on how much of the previous era was spent in willful suspension of difficult clarity versus genuine preparation for what the cycle was building toward. Those are not the same experience, even if from a distance they can look similar. Something brought you to this video before the transit begins. In the framework of the Hermetic tradition and in the framework of every serious esoteric school that has mapped consciousness against astronomical cycles, the timing of when a person encounters specific information is not incidental to the information itself. You are not watching this as someone who found a historical curiosity the night before an interesting astronomical event. You are watching it as someone who is, by the evidence of their presence here, paying a specific kind of attention to the moment they are living inside. That quality of attention is exactly what the initiatory traditions have always said constitutes the meaningful distinction between those who are carried by the cycle and those who navigate it. If you have been feeling like the clarity you're looking for is just out of reach, like something is shifting, but you can't quite name it or work with it yet, I left something in the first pinned comment. It's for those who are ready to engage the shift actively, not just watch it arrive. So what does active engagement with this transit actually look like? Not passive watching, not the stance of, I know about the cycle, so I'll see what happens. The esoteric traditions that tracked these cycles, the mundane astrological schools, the hermetic lineages, the mystery traditions that used astronomical events as orientation instruments for their practitioners, were not passive observers of the cycles they had studied. They prepared for them in specific ways. The preparation was not ritual in the popular sense. It was attentional, structural, and internal. It was about the quality of consciousness that would meet the transition, not about external ceremonies that might influence external events. The preparation that Neptune in Aries specifically calls for is different from the preparation that other kinds of transits call for, because Neptune's primary work is in the domain of collective and personal clarity, the removal of what has been sustained by illusion rather than by substance. The preparation is not about adding things. It is about examining with honest attention what in your life has been sustained by your own version of the collective fog. Not what you know is a problem, what you have been managing not to look at directly. The distinctions are different, and Neptune in Aries will not accept the management of avoidance as a continuing strategy. The first question the transit forces is this: what in your life has been maintained by the conviction that you did not need to look at it closely right now? Not the obvious things, not the problems you have acknowledged and are actively working on. The things you have filed under manageable, under not urgent, under something I will address when conditions are more favorable. Neptune in Aries has historically been the transit during which that filing system is reviewed, not by your choice, but by the withdrawal of the collective and personal capacity to maintain indefinite postponement as a viable orientation. The transit does not wait for a convenient moment. Consider what the abolitionists of the 1860s, the people who had been paying clear attention before the transit, understood that their contemporaries were still successfully managing not to understand. They understood that the contradiction between stated values and practiced reality had a structural expiration date, not a convenient one, not one that could be chosen. The contradiction was always true. What the Neptune in Aries transit did was move the collective capacity for avoidance far enough out of the way that others could no longer avoid the same recognition. The people who were prepared were the ones who had already been looking clearly, who had already done the work of internal clarity before the transit made that clarity unavoidable. This is the practical implication of the Hermetic principle applied to Neptune in Aries. The dissolution that happens collectively is an accurate mirror of what has been present individually. The person who has already done the work of examining their own maintained illusions, who has already faced what the transit will eventually require everyone to face, is not disoriented by the transition. They are oriented by it. They recognize what they are seeing because they have already seen it in themselves. The fog burning off at the collective level confirms what they already knew from the individual level. That confirmation is the experience of the cycle working correctly, not the experience of things going wrong. The popular spiritual approach to a major transit like Neptune in Aries tends to involve practices for aligning with the new energy, rituals for welcoming the frequency shift, ceremonial acknowledgements of the astronomical event. The serious esoteric tradition, the one that produced the Hermetic schools, the mystery traditions, the mundane astrological framework, makes a different emphasis entirely. Preparation for Neptune is not primarily about alignment. It is about clarity. You do not need to receive anything from the transit. You need to be capable of clear sight when the conditions that made blurry sight comfortable are removed. That capacity is built through internal work, not external ceremony. What does that preparation look like practically? The Hermetic tradition, at its operational level, frames this in terms of two specific internal activities. The first is developing the ability to distinguish between what you actually believe, what your actions and your genuine orientation in the world reveal you to be treating as true, and what you believe you believe. The gap between those two things is the domain of maintained illusion. The second activity is identifying the specific areas of your life where that gap is the largest, where your stated understanding of reality and your actual behavior toward it are the most divergent. Those two areas are where the dissolution will arrive first and most unmistakably. A gap between stated belief and actual behavior is a maintained illusion with a cost. You operate according to a constructed story about your situation. That story diverges significantly from the story that your actual pattern of behavior would tell. The cognitive and emotional cost of maintaining that gap is real, even when the gap is not being consciously examined. Neptune in Aries historically corresponds with the moment when those gaps become visible, not just internally, but in the outer world that reflects the inner one. The outer world starts to show the internal gap in ways that are increasingly difficult to explain as coincidence or external circumstance. The gap becomes the persistent friction. The mystery schools that tracked and taught about these cycles did not present them as something to endure passively. The Egyptian astronomical traditions, which used celestial cycles as orientation instruments for temple practice and cultural organization, were using the cycles as information about what quality of work was called for and when. Neptune in Pisces. The extended period that is now ending corresponded with what those traditions would have called a period of deep inward seeking, of expanded vision, of spiritual exploration that does not yet require practical anchoring. What is now arriving is what the initiatory traditions called the test, the moment when the internal preparation meets the external conditions that require it to function, not as theory, as practice. What specifically should be examined in the opening weeks of this transit? Applying the Hermetic diagnostic of as within, so without, the instruction is specific. Look at the areas of your outer world that are showing the most persistent friction, the situations that resist your efforts to change them, the patterns that recur despite your attempts to address them, the circumstances that feel stuck in ways that do not respond to what you have tried. In the Hermetic framework, the outer world is not an independent system, it is a reflection. The areas of persistent outer friction are accurate indicators of the areas of inner maintained illusion. The friction is not the problem, it is the diagnostic. This is not abstract. A person in the early 1860s who understood what Neptune in Aries would do, who recognized the pattern from the tradition they had studied, would have looked at the contradictions in their own life the way the clear-eyed observers of American society were looking at the contradictions in the Republic, with the recognition that those contradictions had a structural expiration date, and that the transit would accelerate the point at which the expiration became unavoidable, not as a threat to be dreaded, as a deadline, the most useful kind, because it removes the illusion that the honest reckoning can be perpetually deferred. The transit is the removal of the option to defer indefinitely. You already know the areas where the honest reckoning has been deferred, not the areas of genuine uncertainty. Genuine uncertainty is a different condition from maintained avoidance, and the Hermetic tradition distinguishes between them carefully. The areas where you have not been uncertain about the assessment, but where you have been reluctant to make it fully, to act on it completely, to let it reach its clear conclusion, those are the areas that Neptune in Aries will touch first and most directly, and there is a significant difference between having those areas touched with the preparation of prior honest examination and having them exposed without any such preparation. The preparation does not make the transition painless. It makes it navigable. The Aries element of this transit needs to be understood correctly, because Aries has a reputation that, when encountered without context, can be discouraging. Aries is not about destruction. Aries is about initiation. The energy that begins a new cycle, the first move that makes everything subsequent possible. What appears to be destruction in Aries energy is more precisely the ignition of space for what comes next. The Civil War was devastating by any measure of human cost and suffering. It was also the initiation of the possibility of a republic that did not depend on enslaving human beings. The old framework had to dissolve completely for the new one to have any room. What Aries brings to Neptune's dissolution is not more devastation. It is the spark that turns the cleared ground into a beginning. You are entering a window that will not return in your lifetime. Neptune will not be in Aries again for approximately 165 years. What initiates in this window, in the collective, in the institutions that organize collective life, and in your own life and understanding, is initiating something that will define the structure of the next cycle for everyone who comes after you. The question is not whether to participate. Everyone participates, whether they understand the cycle or not. The people who were alive in 1861 participated in the Neptune in Aries transit, whether they had heard of the concept or not. The question is whether you participate with understanding of what is happening, with the orientation that the historical record and the Hermetic tradition make available, or whether the pattern finds you without a framework to read it by. Understanding the cycle means three things in practical terms. First, do not resist the dissolution. What Neptune dissolves, it dissolves because the structure was sustaining itself by illusion rather than by substance. Resistance to that dissolution does not preserve the structure. It increases the duration and intensity of the discomfort of its eventual dissolution, which will happen regardless. What is being dissolved does not have the structural integrity to survive the withdrawal of the illusion that was supporting it. The resistance makes the experience more painful without changing the outcome. Second, do not confuse the fog burning off with the world ending. Visibility is not catastrophe. Clarity is not loss. What you can finally see clearly is not new. It was always there. It is just no longer blurry. The third practical instruction, the one that the Hermetic tradition emphasizes most consistently in its teaching on initiatory transitions, is this: turn your attention toward what is igniting, not only what is dissolving, not what is falling, what is beginning. The natural focus during a dissolution period is on what is ending, what is being exposed, what is losing its ability to maintain itself, what is visibly failing. That focus is understandable and in some cases necessary for honest assessment, but the Aries element of this particular transit means that what ignites in the opening window of Neptune in Aries often defines the direction and quality of the entire 14-year transit. What is beginning right now, even in small, barely visible ways, is what the next cycle will be built from. The abolitionist movement did not emerge during Neptune in Aries. It had been building in the margins for decades before 1861. What the transit did was remove the structural capacity of the opposition to maintain the working fiction that the status quo was stable. The movement that had been accumulating in what looked like the margins became visible as what the future actually was. The people who had spent the preceding decades building genuine understanding, genuine relationships, genuine commitment to what was actually true rather than what was conventionally agreed upon. Those people found themselves not at the end of the old world, but at the beginning of a new one. They were prepared not because they had predicted the specific events. They were prepared because they had not been sustaining illusions. That is the frame the Hermetic tradition offers for Neptune in Aries. Those who spent Neptune in Pisces in genuine seeking, not escapist spiritual consumption, not comfort-oriented belief systems that avoid difficult self-examination, but real investigation of what is actually true, enter Neptune in Aries with the significant advantage of having already done a substantial portion of the dissolution work internally. The transit is not arriving for them as a rupture with a reality they had been comfortable in. It is arriving as a confirmation of what they have already, at considerable internal cost, been willing to see. For them, The transition is not an ending. It is an arrival. Not everyone will experience this transit in the same way. The historical record is clear about this. The people who were most invested in maintaining illusions that could no longer be maintained, who had organized the most of their identity, their security, and their social position around the stability of what was dissolving, were the ones most devastated by the dissolution. Not because the transit was more powerful for them, because the gap between their constructed reality and the actual structural reality was the largest. The dissolution that Neptune in Aries brings is proportional, in the experience of it, to the depth and durability of the illusion that preceded it. This is not punitive. It is mechanical. It is accurate. Tomorrow, March 30th, Neptune enters Aries for the first time since 1861. What that marks is not a single event with a single consequence. It is the opening of a window, a 14-year transit period during which the frameworks that have been operating on the basis of collective illusion will encounter the conditions under which their actual structural integrity, or lack of it, becomes visible to anyone paying attention. What you do in this opening window, the quality of consciousness you bring to it, the honesty of your internal examination, the direction of your attention, does not just determine your experience of the next 14 years. It positions you relative to what the cycle is initiating, which will extend well beyond the 14-year transit itself. This is what the Hermetic tradition means by the as above, so below principle in the context of these major cycles. The transition unfolding above is not something that happens to you from the outside. It reads you. It reads the state of your inner world, what you have been sustaining by genuine clarity versus what you have been sustaining by convenient illusion, and reflects that state accurately in the outer world. If your inner world is built on the willingness to see what is actually there, the outer world will show you new beginnings. If your inner world has been sustained primarily by avoidance, the outer world will show you the dissolution of what avoidance was maintaining. The correspondence is not metaphorical. In the Hermetic framework, it is the operating principle of reality itself. The question that matters in the next 24 hours, before this transit begins, is not what is going to happen. The historical record shows that Neptune in Aries transitions involve significant dissolution of collective frameworks and simultaneous ignition of new ones. That will happen with or without your awareness of it. The question that matters is, in which direction are you positioned? Are you positioned on the side of what the cycle is dissolving, with your security, your certainty, your identity organized around the maintenance of frameworks that will not survive the transition? Or are you positioned on the side of what is initiating, with the internal clarity, the genuine understanding, and the willingness to see accurately that makes the transition an arrival rather than a rupture? Something brought you here. That is not a small thing. In the framework of the tradition that has tracked these cycles for centuries, the tradition that produced the Hermetic principle, the mystery school teachings on cosmic cycles, the mundane astrological framework, the timing of when a person encounters specific information is not incidental. It is part of the information. You are not watching this as a curious outside observer who happened across an interesting historical pattern. You are inside a transit window that opens tomorrow, and you found this before it opened. Every initiatory tradition that has ever mapped consciousness against cosmic cycles has said the same thing about that kind of timing. It is not random, and it is not passive. The question is what you do with it. What is the Hermetic tradition's actual instruction for the opening of a Neptune in Aries transit? Not a ritual, not a specific ceremony. An orientation, a quality of attention to bring to the next days and weeks. Look for what is beginning, not what is ending, and you will see that without any particular effort. Look for what is initiating. Aries is the first sign. It initiates. What is beginning in your life right now, even in the smallest and least dramatic ways? What has been waiting for the previous framework to shift enough to create the room it needed? What have you been sensing was possible, but that the accumulated weight of the previous era had not yet allowed to move? Those are the seeds. That is what Neptune in Aries is clearing ground for. 165 years. The full orbit of Neptune around the Sun, completed, bringing the transit back to the beginning of the zodiac. The last of those who lived through the previous opening are gone. What they built, what they initiated, what they endured, and what they created in that 14-year window, it shaped the world that you were born into. And now the window opens again, with you in it, with awareness of what is happening, in the first hours of a transit that will define the next 14 years of collective experience and the next generation of what becomes possible. The people who used the opening well in 1861 did not know how their work would be remembered. They knew the cycle was real, and they acted accordingly. This is not a moment to observe from a comfortable distance. It is a moment to step into with the clearest possible understanding of what is actually true in your own life, not what is comfortable to believe, not what the previous collective framework made it easy to sustain, not what has been maintained by the general agreement that some things are better left unexamined. What is actually true, that is the preparation Neptune in Aries is calling for. And if you have been building that clarity, if something about this video is confirming what you have been sensing rather than introducing something entirely new, you are more prepared than you may have realized. The recognition itself is a form of preparation. If you stayed until the end of this video, write in the comments, "I enter the new era," not as aspiration, as a recognition that the window is open, that you found this at this specific moment, and that awareness of what the cycle is doing is itself a form of preparation. I've placed another video on your screen right now, the next piece of context for what is unfolding. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.